Today's course is the ASP.NET MVC 5 course. ASP.NET MVC 5 is used for building web applications. This course starts with the introduction, wherein we cover the MVC architecture and the need for it. This is followed by a first MVC Hello World application. We would then cover up the various components of ASP.NET MVC framework and its capabilities in detail with practical real-life examples, and finally conclude the course with Ajax. So let's start with our course. So for those who have been working on .NET Technology, .NET Web Forms, so we know that Microsoft already provides a framework for building web applications in the form of ASP.NET Web Forms. So why did we need a new framework? To understand that, let's understand the history of ASP.NET Web Forms. So when ASP.NET Web Forms was introduced, it was a big idea. With Web Forms, Microsoft attempted to hide the HTTP and HTML base. The base idea was to make web development look somewhat like Windows development. This served as a very productive venture. However, over a period of time, the very aspects on the basis of which ASP.NET Web Forms was introduced turned out to be quite disadvantageous. So let's look at the various disadvantages of ASP.NET Web Forms. So all of us know that HTTP is stateless. To overcome this, ASP.NET Web Forms offered the view state technique, with which web appears to be stateful. However, this mechanism results in large blocks of data being transferred between the client and the server, thereby leading to slower response times and increasing the bandwidth demands of the server. When ASP.NET Web Forms were introduced, Microsoft claimed that it separated the UI from the code base. However, in essence, this was a kind of a false sense of separation. Web Forms provided code behind model to de-link the UI from the business logic. However, the developers can manipulate the UI elements using code behind. So essentially, this was not the perfect separation of concerns. With ASP.NET Web Forms, we have a limited control over the HTML output. So ASP.NET Web Forms offers its own UI controls such as the text box, the grid, the button, and these can be drag and dropped on the web form that we are creating. When rendered, these elements output do not necessarily meet the web standards. Neither does it make use of CSS for styling. Though much of this can be seen as improved in the current versions, it can still be sometimes tricky to get the desired HTML output. So ASP.NET Web Forms framework does not provide any extensibility points. As a developer, implementing custom behavior is quite difficult using this framework. And most importantly, testability, unit testing as well as automated testing is quite low when we are making use of ASP.NET Web Forms. This is because of its tightly coupled architecture. This architecture is unsuitable for unit testing. So does this mean that we have to completely do away with ASP.NET Web Forms? Of course not. There are still some things which are good about ASP.NET. It's not all bad. It's definitely good for achieving quick results. It's more productive. However, what's important to note that it's difficult to test and maintain. So let's look at where web development stands today. The drive for web standards compliance has increased the usage of HTML, JavaScript, as well as CSS. Applications need to serve different platforms, devices, and browsers, and that's where the web standards come into picture. HTML5 by itself serves rich UI capabilities, and this, coupled with JavaScript plugins like jQuery, Knockout.js, AngularJS, has made standards much more important. Today, web technology serves JSON data. to client technologies such as Ajax. So data is not just limited to XML or SOAP, it also includes JSON data. The growing importance of test-driven development, which we know as TDD, and Agile, again can be seen very highly in web development. So considering all this, which includes the pitfalls of ASP.NET Web Forms and the growing use of web standards, Microsoft realized the need of a new framework. This is where ASP.NET MVC was born. So let's look at how ASP.NET MVC is different from our typical web forms and what was the need of this new framework. So one of the major advantages of this framework is that it's based on the MVC architecture. So the MVC architecture is not something new, and we'll understand more details about what this architecture is all about in the preceding slides. The MVC architecture helps a lot in the separation of concerns, which was one of the major drawbacks of ASP.NET Web Forms. Second important point to note is that the framework is built as a series of independent components that satisfy an interface or an abstract class. Each of these components can be customized as per your needs. So to summarize, the ASP.NET MVC framework is extensible to a large extent. It produces clean markup, which is standards compliant. It makes use of CSS for styling and also allows use of plugins like jQuery, Knockout.js, Bootstrap. MVC architecture is maintainable and testable because of the very important fact that it has a clear separation between the components. It provides wizards to create unit test projects, and it also works very well with automated testing. And if all this isn't enough, Microsoft introduced ASP.MVC as an open source. You can always go ahead and download the source code for this framework, modify it, and compile your own version. So isn't that a lot? Now that we've understood the benefits of ASP.NET MVC, let's look at the architecture. So what exactly is MVC architecture? So when we're talking about MVC, it's not just limited to Microsoft, it's not just limited to ASP.NET, it's an architecture. So this architecture has three components: the controller, the model, and the view. The models contain or represent data, so it could be data, say a patient data or an employee data. All such kinds of data is represented by the model. Views is what an end user sees. These render the model as the user interface. And finally, the controller. The controller is at the heart of the MVC architecture. It is responsible for processing the request. It performs operations on the model and selects the view to render to the user. So to go on, we can say that model is maintained for preserving. So the model is responsible for maintaining and preserving the overall state and consistency of data. They don't deal with rendering UI or processing requests. That responsibility belongs to the controller and views. The views have no direct awareness about the model, and the two do not directly communicate with each other. The controllers are the bridge between the models and the views. So now that we've understood the components, let's look at how the ASP.NET MVC framework works. So you can see a request coming in. This request is essentially a request that comes in from the browser. So when a request comes in, it first hits the controller. So as we learned, controller is the heart of the MVC architecture. The controller fetches the model, and then this model data is passed to the view. The view binds the data to the UI elements and sends the HTML output to the browser. So now that we have understood the MVC architecture and the need of this framework, let's start learning it. To start on with it, you need to have a basic knowledge of HTML and CSS and a good working knowledge of C#, since that's the programming language that we are going to use for all our examples. As far as any software is concerned, all that you need is the Visual Studio 2013 Express web version. You need the 2013 version because MVC5 is supported only in versions of 2012 and above. The Express version is available for free and can be downloaded from the link mentioned here.